Gerald L.K. Smith, a white supremacist politician and a Disciples of Christ minister, is widely recognized for his push to spread Christian nationalism throughout the United States. After the Indiana Klan was exposed for attempting to seize control of the government in the late 1920s, Smith moved to Shreveport and made connections with key political figures, including Louisiana Governor Huey P. Long. Among other things, Smith is infamous for his Christian nationalist crusades of the late 1940s. The group was formally organized in St. Louis in 1942 to preserve America as a Christian nation, being conscious of a highly organized campaign to substitute Jewish tradition for Christian tradition, to oppose communism, world government and immigration, and to, quote, fight mongrelization and all attempts to force the intermixture of the black and white races. As it relates to the NAR, Smith is of key interest in multiple areas of influence, through various connections to key figures in the latter rain movement and ideologies presented in the form of racist and anti-Semitic doctrine. Smith launched the group's political and religious newsletter, The Cross and the Flag, in 1947, the same year that latter rain broke out in North Battleford, Saskatchewan. He also had ties to latter rain leader and early voice of healing publicist, Jack Moore, in Shreveport, through Moore's father-in-law, Reverend Grover C. Lout. Lau was engaged in special police work while working on the Shreveport Ministerial Association, of which Smith's Shreveport Christ Christian Church and his predecessor, Dr. A. Preston Gray, were affiliated. The association openly engaged in political and religious espionage. As Smith rose through the ranks of the white Christian nationalist underworld to become the imperial wizard of the California Klan, his lieutenant was Reverend Wesley A. Swift, a key figure in transitioning British Israelism into Christian identity and source of latter rain's two-seed or serpent seed doctrine. It is largely due to the work of Smith and Swift that the group earned the label White Christian Nationalists. Though Smith's organization of Christian nationalists began in the 1940s, the movement was by no means in its infancy. Smith was strongly aligned with the British Israel theory, and due to his obsession with the anti-Semitic protocols of the learned elders of Zion, he saw the formation of the nation of Israel as the first step in a long battle against what he, and many others of the British Israel Christian identity groups, claimed to be the Jewish problem. They viewed the formation of the nation of Israel as divinely inspired by God, but believed the Jewish Americans to be the so-called false Jews that were filled with satanic blood from Christian identity's two-seed theory. However, before Smith's so-called Jewish problem, there was the so-called Negro problem of Smith's political and religious forefathers. Prior to that was the so-called Indian problem of their fathers. In fact, some historians of white supremacy trace the origins of Christian nationalism all the way back to 1452, when Pope Nicholas V granted Portuguese King Alfonso V rights to root out all Muslims and pagans and anyone opposed to Christianity by whatever means possible. Quote, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, referring to Muslims and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever, held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Considering the NAR Seven-Mountain Mandate, known as the Seven-Mountain Dominionism theology, the Pope's charge to invade, subdue, and pillage the kingdoms of all in opposition is very troubling. NAR leaders believe there are aspects of today's society that believers should seek to invade, influence, and subdue. Family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, and government. As an anti-Catholic movement, how did this mandate develop? How did the NAR abandon the Apostle Paul's charge to Titus and the early church for leading through good example rather than forcible conversion? As it relates to the Christian identity themes found in NAR agenda, our story goes back to the year 1877, when President Grant commissioned a bipartisan solution to political divisions. On January 29, 1877, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Electoral Commission Act, which established a 15-member commission of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats to settle the disputed 1876 election. New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden had just 1 vote shy of the 185 required electoral votes, and 20 electoral votes from Florida, Louisiana, Oregon, and South Carolina were unresolved. Both Tilden and Ohio Governor Rutherford B. Hayes claimed victory in those states, and it was left to the Electoral Commission to decide the next president. Hayes ultimately won the presidency after the Compromise of 1877 ended in a promise that he would withdraw federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction. As a result, Hayes was never seen as credible by his opponents, and he was taunted with such epithets as his fraudulency and Ruth the Fraud. Hayes did not view himself as a Christian, let alone a descendant from the lost tribes of Israel. He often stated that he was not a Christian and did not belong to any church. An entry in his personal diary summed it up: "The literature of the Bible should be studied as one studies Shakespeare." Rutherford was not in favor of mixing religion with politics, often being branded as a political enemy by one party or another for keeping the two separate while in office. Though the First Amendment to the Constitution established a separation between church and state, there were many people who viewed that separation as a political weakness, especially when legislation concerned core values established by Christian churches. For Americans in the South, federal enforcement of the rights of freedmen and freedwomen was seen as a violation of the First Amendment, and Rutherford represented an enemy of both church and state, regardless of the compromise. Rutherford's wife was a devout Methodist, and while not religious, Rutherford wrote that he enjoyed attending the Methodist Church. This was especially the case with Southerners unhappy with the outcome of the Civil War. During the war, Northern Methodists used the army to seize control of several Methodist churches in large cities. By 1871, the Northern Methodists had 88,000 black members in the South and had opened numerous schools for them. In the South, the issue of race divided the political party lines. Southern Democrats strongly opposed the Republican Party for multiple reasons, the biggest of which had to do with the color of the constituent skin. Blacks in the South made up a core element of the Republican Party. Black ministers in the South had a significant role in politics. Over 100 black ministers held offices in state legislatures during Reconstruction, and several black ministers were elected to Congress. In the North, several denominations, especially the Methodists, supported the radical Republican agenda. Radical Republicans were a faction within the Republican Party that referred to themselves as radicals due to their goal of immediate, complete, and permanent eradication of slavery in the United States. Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson of Philadelphia built his legacy as the high priest of the radical Republicans by organizing Methodists for the cause. These factions eventually led to the social gospel movement within liberal Christianity and, ultimately, the liberal fundamentalist debate. The divisions in American Christianity, combined with the general lack of trust in both elected officials and religious groups, amplified by the issue of race, created an open field for which the British Israel doctrine could easily take root. Shortly before Hayes was elected in 1876, Union Congregational Church pastor Joseph Wilde of Brooklyn did just that. Starting that year, Wilde preached a series of 130 British Israel sermons across the span of 3 years. In 1879, he began publishing pamphlets to spread the British Israel message. For Wilde, that message was one of both religious and political superiority. All across the United States and Canada, British Israel ministers, churches, and organizations followed suit. In the 1880s, Toronto clergyman W. H. Poole began spreading British Israelism in Ontario and in the United States. M. Eshelman, an author and student of Edward Hine, published his British Israel book, Two Sticks, or The Lost Tribes of Israel Discovered. Reverend Elihu P. Ingersoll, a congregational preacher from Kansas, and Reverend George O. Barnes, an evangelist from Kentucky, also published books on British Israelism. The movement's growth in the US eventually attracted Edward Hine himself. From 1884 to 1888, Hine lectured in cities throughout the United States and Canada, appearing in large cities in the eastern Midwest, as well as a host of smaller communities. By the time Hine returned to England, his name had been well established in North America, and the British Israel movement had a strong foothold in the United States and Canada. Of all the leaders of British Israelism in the United States, none were as influential as Professor C.A.L. Totten, referred to by notable white supremacists in the Christian identity movement as Professor Totten of Yale. In fact, Totten was so well recognized in the United States and abroad that his work was the catalyst for Hine's tour throughout North America. Hine stayed with Totten in New Haven for several weeks and later described Totten as, quote, "a great help to me and has a good score of marvelous identifications of the Americans with Manasseh." Professor Totten intends to publish his researches for the good of America. Totten was a West Point graduate from a military family who served as a first lieutenant on the post-Civil War Army. He is credited as one of the first to bring the practice of wargaming from Germany to the United States and published his book on the subject, Strategos, in 1880. Though it was later believed to be derived from the Prussian Kriegspiel via translations held by the British military officers in the 1870s, Totten's version had the advantage of American publication and earned recognition whether plagiarized or not. So much so that in 1889, Totten was appointed as the Professor of Military Science and Tactics at Yale University. He remained there until August of 1893, at which time he resigned to focus solely upon writing apocalyptic and esoteric interpretations of the British Israel doctrine. Throughout his life, Totten would publish over 180 books and articles, including a 26-volume series entitled Our Race, dedicated to British Israelism. Totten linked the British Israel movement with Anglo-Saxonism, a secular movement that believed in the destiny of Anglo-Saxons to rule the world. Totten's works attracted countless people to British Israelism, including dozens of influential evangelists and authors. Totten fully accepted Hine's theory that the people of the United States were the descendants of the tribe of Manasseh and furthered that notion by claiming that historical artifacts in American history held symbolic meaning, confirming British Israelism. His 1897 book, The Seal of History, for example, allegedly linked the Great Seal of the United States to the tribe of Manasseh. As a British Israelite, Totten was strongly opposed to the metric system and was an active member in the International Institute for Preserving and Perfecting Anglo-Saxon Weights and Measures. He claimed that as Israelites, the United States and Great Britain were destined to rule the world. As rulers, the imperial system would reign, and the metric system was a scheme that would eventually fail. His thoughts were embedded in the group's theme song, A Pint's a Pound the World Around, which Totten himself wrote in 1883. According to Totten and the song, the Anglo-Saxon race shall rule the earth from shore to shore. The unusual problem, as Totten's militant form of British Israelism suggests, lies within one single word from the song: race. In Totten's era, the United States faced the so-called Negro problem, and it is clear which race was suggested. Gerald L.K. Smith believed that this word, race, would relate to the so-called Jewish problem. However, ignoring the anti-Semitic themes about the gospel and the Jews, many churches in the NAR today present themselves as neither racist nor anti-Semitic. How would the NAR view this phrase today? How did Totten's religious beliefs of Anglo-Saxons' rule of the world transition to the NAR views on dominionism? To find out, we must first explore how Totten's views spread through the first wave of Pentecostalism.